I want to thank everyone for coming. This is a beautiful night on the Delaware, and these will be continued events on board level that we'll be holding, so hope to see you all many times again. So I'm going to introduce Ralph. As you can see, he's a very interesting guy, and I'm going to let you take off, and Ray Harrison's going to speak, and Mike O'Hara is going to say a few words, and have a great time.
You know, Larry knows I always wanted to be a rock star, so just adjusting this mic sort of gives me that thrill feeling of it. Now, if you start to see me moving,
if we start waving our cigarette lighters,
that would be great. We're just cell phones nowadays. Can you all hear me? Okay.
yes.
Hi, I'm Ralph Walkling, and I am a finance professor by training. But for the past 8 years, I've been founded and run the Center for Corporate Governance at Drexel University. So my career in academia was a lot of analyzing what companies are doing, what boards are doing, particularly mergers and acquisitions. And it turns out that mergers and acquisitions are a fertile ground for looking at corporate governance issues in particular, because you think of corporate governance, it's aligning owner and manager interests. What are the best techniques for doing that? And mergers and acquisitions are fraught with a lot of potential situations where you better have the right governance in place. So it's that passion for understanding this in a really practical sense that really drew me to Drexel. Drexel is a university known for looking at the practical side of things. And so at Drexel, the Center for Corporate Governance exists as a two-way street to the open exchange of ideas. And to give you an illustration of how important I think that is, back in the 80s, when I was a young assistant professor, still had no hair, but a young assistant professor, I was giving a presentation to a group of executives like yourselves, and I said, here's a model that we've developed to predict the probability of tender offer success. And I'm going through the model, and somebody says, you're missing a variable. This is about 1984, and I said, what variable? The ratio of sport coats to suits in the boardroom. I said, could you elaborate? He says, well, your sport coats are your independent directors. Now think 80s governance too. You know, your suits are your management. If you look at that proportion, you're more likely to have tender offer success if you have more independent directors. And since that time, of course, the study of independent directors has been a growth industry. And, you know, the government's been fascinated by it, and everyone else has been fascinated by it. So that's the type of thing we do. I've distributed some material. You'll see our governance board, our advisory board, consists of a lot of really exciting executives that come together to talk and debate issues in corporate governance. And I learn a lot from that. I like to sprinkle what I believe makes sense at that, and I like to hear the feedback. So it's in that spirit that I'd like to encourage a dialogue tonight, rather than just talking for 30 minutes or so. I really hope that you'll stop me, and wherever the conversation goes, we'll let it wander. Speaking of that, Larry, I once had a dean that introduced me by saying, Ralph's a great teacher. Because I read a student evaluation once that said, if I only had 30 minutes to live, I'd like to live it listening to Professor Walkling speak. And I thought, wow. Because then I read the asterisk, and it said, because he can make 30 minutes seem like an eternity. I will try not to do that. I will try not to do that. It's no surprise that corporate governance is a hot topic today. You only have to look at the headlines. But the fact is that these issues have been around for a long, long time. If I was showing you a PowerPoint, I'd show you a Business Week from 1998 that talks about the rise in executive pay. I'd show you a Directors and Boards article from 1962 that asks the question, is any CEO worth $1 million? And I will read to you some headlines from the New York Times October 5th, 1939, proposes change in executive pay. October 4th, 1937, executive pay rise above workers' gain. April 28, 1935, big salaries in hard times. July 15, 1933, lowering high salaries. August 18, 1929, suggests a gauge for executive pay. December 14, 1922, explaining the big salary of a railroad head. They're the same issues that we're talking about today. I mean, as we speak, there are articles in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, being debated on Wall Street about, oh, let's mandate that we report executive pay to the median pay. And we want to look at this wage gap. So the problems are still the alignment of owner-manager interests. The solutions are evolving. But the basic techniques and principles and worries, I think, remain pretty much the same. The subject that I thought I would talk about tonight is just broadly shareholder access to the boardroom, but more particularly electing directors. What do we know about votes in director elections? This group certainly knows the importance of directors, and it certainly knows the importance of representation of shareholders and fiduciary duties. The question is, how do we elect directors, and what are the factors that lead to the election of directors? I got interested in this question because I was interested in the subject of majority voting, and I may get to that in a little bit. There's a couple ways that you can elect directors. There's majority voting and plurality voting. But majority voting says you've got to have more than 50%, or you may face some repercussions. Plurality voting says those with the highest number of votes get elected. In corporate America, if you have 5 folks nominated for 5 seats, you're going to be elected, even if you have a single vote. So I was interested in that, but as I started to look at what we knew about director elections, I found a lot of anecdotes, but I didn't see any hard evidence. And so believing in empirical-based decision-making, we sought to understand it a little better. We looked at 2,500 director elections over the past decade. I don't recall the exact years, but somewhere in the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And we asked 3 questions. When shareholders, meaning the broad spectrum, institutions, individuals, so forth, vote in director elections, do they vote as if, 1, corporate governance matters? Do they vote as if firm performance matters? And do they vote as if director performance matters? Now you can imagine the alternative hypothesis is you get your proxy statement and, I don't have time for this. My vote isn't going to matter. Certainly that's the way some individuals might think about it. Institutions, we hope, are spending a little bit more time. So the answer to those 3 questions, and we have imperfect measures of these things, admittedly. For example, how do we know that a director is doing a good job? We look at truancy. That's the only thing that's really reported. And we look at the institutional shareholders' recommendations. Not a perfect measure by any means. But the answer to those 3 questions, in shareholder elections, in these 2,500 elections, do shareholders vote as if firm performance matters? Do they vote as if governance matters? Do they vote as if director performance matters? The answer is a solid statistical yes. A very solid, significant yes. And I use the word statistical for purpose. And I'd like to sort of just pause and ask you, what factors do you think would relate to the amount of votes that directors get? And anecdotally, we know it's high. And many of you are directors, and you know that your votes tend to be pretty high. What are the factors do you think that relate to the amount of votes that directors get? Tucker? Age. Okay.
Name recognition.
Name of the person? That's interesting. It's one we didn't look at. Oh, you mean it's a well-known name, or alphabetical, or?
No, well-known.
Okay.
Nowadays, it's the advisory group for ISS,
ISS? Glass Lewis? Okay? Rate of return, shareholder ownership, tenure of the CEO, percent of independent directors if you're talking about the four stocks. We looked at all of these factors except for the name recognition factor. If I can think of a way to quantify that, Ray, I will jump on that. And all of these things tended to be statistically significant. But I said statistically significant for a reason. Most of them have a trivial effect. Yeah, as a statistician, I said, oh, good, that's significant. Put a little asterisk beside that. That, even in our data, if you are a poorly performing director in a poorly performing company with bad governance, you got 92% of the vote instead of 94% of the vote. Now, what did matter, right? ISS. ISS was the single largest factor in swinging votes in director elections. And it swung votes on average by 18%. If ISS said, no, we don't recommend this director, votes dropped by 18%. And it's even more powerful than that because you and I might look at ISS and say, where in the devil did they come up with that recommendation? But there are also very practical items that we would think they would take into account, like the things you all mentioned. We controlled for those and then said, this is what we can't explain about the ISS recommendation. And that's the factor we put into our analysis. So even controlling for all those other things, 18%. The second most important was director truancy, and that was 14%. And after that, you're talking about a 2% move or a 1% move, statistically significant, but not very large. So we asked, yes?
Now, did you take a look at any situations where there was a proxy fight going on and the voters were being pushed information that might have been derogatory to certain or supportive of certain directors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In our sample, that didn't happen. Amazingly, in the 2,500 election, there were only 4 where there was any contested ballot. And so we really didn't have a large enough sample to address that. But I think that's interesting, and from what I've seen, the ISS recommendations are certainly influencing what's coming out on some say-on-pay votes and some other situations as well. Rick?
One of the things we found out at ISS is our company had a poison pill. And if you had a poison pill, it didn't matter how good you performed, you were done. They basically said vote against the directors.
A blanket recommendation, let's vote against them.
Yeah, if you had a poison pill, period. No questions asked. And then next thing was the classified board.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's the same thing with the staggered board, I would suspect. And incidentally, the combination of those two factors is really among the most powerful things in keeping management in place. There are, and I'm digressing on some other studies, but there's a study that develops what's called a G index, named for one of the guys that founded it. And it has 23 factors that they claim these are good governance factors. They're really anti-takeover factors, anti-takeover measures. And some other folks have said, you don't need 23, you need 6. And then someone else said, you don't need 6, you need 2. Does the firm have a poison pill? Does it have a staggered board? Why are those two important? Because if you don't have a staggered board, I can get on the board and remove the pill. But if you have a staggered board, it's going to take me 3 years, and then I can't get on there and remove the pill in a timely fashion. So, very interesting. Yes, Paul?
I'm coming back to this question, which I think is interesting because it seems that, I don't know what you call that, but it's very rare that you have conflict at this level, like what you mentioned. So in fact, for me, board and votes is a place where people are very complacent. I don't know if that's the word for that, but you never get any problems. So people are just not interested. Have you ever studied this kind of stuff, the ratio of conflict versus just we don't care? Yeah, that's the word.
The question is, have we looked at conflict versus we don't care? And I presume you're meaning with inside the boardroom?
No, it's the people who are voting, it's like you're
Oh.
voting for an election for the president or whatever. People are just voting or don't vote, and they just don't care.
In fact, we've started to look at the complacency issue,
Complacency.
the apathy issue. But, most companies are certainly large companies are 70% owned by institutional investors. And many of those are taking a more and more active role in governance. So I still think there's room to look at that, particularly in smaller companies, and I do think it's an interesting issue. I was going to say, in my impression,
I'm
there aren't
looking
many
at it
boards that are complacent
different
these
ways.
days. They all tend to be pretty active.
Yeah, when I am a shareholder, I own, not even a grain of salt of the company, and I really don't care. So most of the time I forget this kind of stuff. And I don't know how many people are like me. Then you have the big owners of the company, and it seems to me that they are very, based on my experience, which is absolutely peanuts.
We tried to get at that by looking at the distribution of ownership a little bit, but most of ours, due to data limitations, were large companies, so they tended to have an awful lot of institutional ownership.
Because it seems when there is a conflict, like somebody was an active shareholder or activist shareholder, it seems that it's always the news, so it must not be something very frequent.
Yeah, activist shareholders, certainly are quite a force in the boardroom.
Activist funds are now becoming quite an event as well. So you raise money to invest in companies and then create an activist situation.
For the purpose of shaking it up. Yeah. Yes.
Have you looked into the kind of egregious conflict of interest versus the subtle conflict of interest ratio that exists oftentimes?
Give me some examples.
Between the board, basically with the board and the CEO and the management all just reinforce each other. You can look at many different scenarios. That's some of the behaviors of Coca-Cola or other banks, for example, in 2008.
The question is egregious conflicts of interest versus more subtle conflicts of interest. Anytime we can measure something like that, we try to look at it. I did a study in the 80s of what relates to a resisted tender offer from a non-resisted tender offer, and the only factor that came out was managerial ownership. It wasn't performance. It wasn't any of the normal governance characteristics you would see. It was purely driven by managerial ownership. And you can imagine that I do face a conflict of interest as a manager. Am I doing what's right for the shareholders and throwing myself out of a job? Well, I don't think that's as much of a factor today as it certainly seemed to be in the 80s. But it relates to golden parachutes, doesn't it? I've always been very suspicious of golden parachutes. What the heck are you talking about? Why would I have to give you this bonus to do the right thing? But the reality is, if you want to put it, and the evidence is that golden parachutes tend to be approved by shareholders, and they don't tend to you don't tend to see losses in firm value when they're announced. And from an economist's point of view, if you want to put the positive argument on it, you say you're aligning incentives. When you hire me to run the company, you say, Ralph, I'll do the right thing by you. I can't put everything into the contract, but if you do the right thing by this company, we're going to do the right thing by you. And the next thing that happens is Tucker comes in and takes over the company, and where's my implicit contract? So, arguably, the golden parachutes protect against that. Now, in a separate study than the one I'm talking about, we asked this question. What if you look at the golden parachute relative to the merger pay package itself? If you take over my company, I've got this merger pay package that I'm going to get. I've got the stock that's going to be sold. I've got these options that are going to vest. And I presumably will lose my salary. We can assume I might get reemployed. We can build a model around that. What happens if the golden parachute is too rich relative to that? Do I create a rush to sale? And what happens if the golden parachute is too small relative to that? Do I create unyielding resistance to sale? And as you might guess, we found some support along those lines. Executives that had a parachute that was very, very rich relative to the rest of the package tended to also sell their companies for lower premium. So definitely there was some indication of a problem there. But on the other hand, executives that had higher parachutes were more likely to get a sale process going in the first place. And there's some indication that the boards may have purposely enriched the parachutes to get that done. So you've got to think about that too. It's interesting, I was presenting this particular subject to our advisory board, and Raj Gupta said, I don't think that the golden parachute is that large relative to the pay package. And I said, Raj, in our sample, it was 30% of the pay package. It was very, very large. So hopefully that didn't indicate that he didn't negotiate for a large enough situation. But I want to come back to this electing director study and say that, so I've now established that there are several factors that are really important statistically. There are two that are really important economically. And we ask the question, do votes matter? If you're talking about a 1% move or a 0.5% move on these factors, do they really matter? Does voting matter? And this is where I think the answer is surprising. It's not surprising that they don't matter for board seats. If you're nominated, you're elected. And the typical director is getting 90, 91%, 92%, 94%. Very few are getting under 50%. Very few are getting under 70%. So if you're nominated, unless it's a contested election, you're going to be elected. This is what was surprising to me. If the board had even slightly lower votes, excess executive compensation tended to be reined in the subsequent years. And then, if instead of looking at the board, we say, well, what if we just focus on the comp committee, it's a much stronger and powerful result. Now, we're talking now about the 1% and 2% changes in director votes translating into things that are happening in the board. And I'm not saying that directors are conscious of this, but I'm saying it's in the data.
I apologize. Say that again, Ralph. If I'm a director and I am the head of the compensation committee and I got less votes than I quote should have gotten, then it's likely that the executive compensation for the management team is going to go down.
That's right. That's right. The excess, what we do is have a model of what comp should be, and then it's not a perfect model, but it's hopefully an unbiased one. Excesses tend to be reined in after that. And my guess from interacting with directors, it's not that directors are saying, look, we need to take action, but they're subtly aware of what's going on. And I've certainly had many folks talk to me about, why do you think I got 87%? And you know, as if that's a terrible thing when they were used to getting 92%. And the same thing happened with poison pills and staggered boards. If the board as a whole got slightly lower votes, staggered boards tend to be repealed. Golden parachute, and not golden parachute, poison pills tended to be removed. And then if you look at the governance committee and look at their votes, it was even smaller. It was even a more powerful effect than that. So what do I take from all of this? A really good exercise, I think, in trying to understand what's going on in electing of directors and what really matters. And even if the votes don't appear to matter in the election of directors, they do matter in what's going on in the boardroom. So that was the essence of that particular analysis. It led us, we've done some other work. I mentioned the golden parachute work. But I'd be happy to talk just a few minutes about say-on pay that we've done some work on, or majority versus plurality elections, or any other questions that you might have, or any questions you think that we should be addressing and haven't. Yes.
Have you analyzed the most effective formulas for board compensation?
Effective formulas for board compensation? No, we haven't. No, we haven't. Very interesting analysis to be done there on that. Tucker?
I'm curious, do you have the data on how the votes actually play out in individual matters? And how many times you've got a unanimous vote versus a simple majority to carry an issue and been able to do an analytics on that?
For board decisions, no, we
Yeah.
do not. And I'd
That's
like
not
to,
public data, is it?
it's not public data to my knowledge. I'd like to know that. My sense from the directors I interact with, though, is that a lot of times boards, and correct me, because you folks are in the trenches, a lot of times boards will thrash out an issue and debate, and if somebody feels strongly about it, you'll debate it until they feel comfortable about it, and then the vote ends up being unanimous anyway.
Do you think that there will ever be a significant movement of separation of CEO and chairman? Is that likely to pick up traction?
Yeah, the question is separation of CEO and chairman, and certainly in other countries it's done a lot more than it is here. There's a movement certainly continuing in our country to separate CEO and chairman. I don't know. I kind of hope it doesn't
Why?
become a reality. You know, from a theorist point of view, oh, this is a great thing. I want to separate these two roles. But from a practical point of view, I suspect there are times and personalities. Ray, you could speak to this more eloquently than I could. But my guess is that certain models work for certain boards, and I hate a one-size-fits-all mentality. My priors are yes, separate those roles. But I've seen cases where they seem to work very well in a combined sense. So I'm not sure. Maybe that we haven't asked the question in the right way. Certainly if you had a CEO that was not giving the board the right information as chairman of the board and controlling that flow of information, I would be very worried. And so it may be that if we looked in those avenues, when companies get into great difficulty, is it because they were not voting or not aware of the right issues?
Ralph, you might
Yes.
be aware of this, but in Asia, or at least parts of Asia and in Europe, there's actually two boards. There's a supervisory board and an operational board. The supervisory board supervises the board, the other board, right?
Absolutely.
So they've gone
Absolutely.
one more iteration on that.
Some of you know that I'm about to embark on an international trip, and I've been asked for some time to make some presentations, and we're concentrating this fall on the Asia Pacific region. One of the things I'm doing is trying to understand what's going on in various other countries. New Zealand had say on pay years before we did. By the way, I'm really proud of the fact that we were studying say on pay back in 2008. And just aside on that, Paul, and I'll come back to your question. I had a young assistant professor come up to me and say, Ralph, I think we should study say on pay. And I said, this was about 2007. And I said, what's going on? And he said, it just passed the House, and this guy named Barack Obama has introduced it in the Senate. And we don't know that it will pass the Senate. So I studied it, and I said, well, yeah, Jay, it's just been introduced in the Senate. It has to pass the Senate, and it has to be enacted into law. Bush says he's not going to push it, and Barack Obama's trailing Hillary Clinton. So, I mean, he's not going to get to these votes. What the heck is going on? And besides, it's an advisory vote. Say on pay is, how do you feel about this? Well, the history of advisory votes having any impact is nil. It's like there's no impact. So I said, I don't think we're going to find anything. But nevertheless, we went and looked, and we said, when this bill passed the House, even though it hadn't passed the Senate, even though Bush said he would veto it, did it have any effect in the marketplace? And we looked at the situations, the companies where we thought it would be more likely to have an impact, and the companies where we thought it was less likely. and we tested 3 hypotheses. One was, it's a democracy. Let the shareholders vote. This will be a good thing. It'll be a very positive effect. The second is disruption. Come on. The board members are the experts. They've got the comp committees. They've got the comp consultants. We don't need more chiefs in there trying to stir up the brew, or what the mixed metaphors is. And the third was the one I thought would be no effect. Come on, it's advisory votes. Well, surprisingly, we found it did matter in some companies. It mattered in companies where the CEO tended to be overpaid. In companies that were more reactive to shareholders matter, and that was a positive. It was a positive. There were other situations where it was negative, not statistically significantly negative, but as a bad statistician would say, suggestive, which is not academically correct to say. But that brings me back to one size doesn't fit all, and so I'm wary of. I mean, we know why we've got an excess of regulation now. The regulatory pendulum swings back and forth from too much to too little. And it's really easy to observe when we don't have enough. And so, governments rush in to put all these regulations in place. It's tougher to observe when we've got too much. And it's even tougher after we say there's too much regulation to then go ahead and try to repeal it once agencies are created, they get a life of their own and want to perpetuate. So, Paul, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question for you, which was when you do your research, I mean, do you look at the size of the company? Because I'm a shareholder in big companies, but I have experience with board of very small company, and it seems to me that it's a completely different world. So if you can apply something for a company, do you take that
we look
into
at the size
account?
of the company. That's a factor that's almost in every analysis. You have to look at the size of the company. There are just so many things that change with size of the company. But having said that, when we look at executive compensation, we currently have a database of probably the 1,500 firms in the United States, and smaller firms are not represented as well. Private firms, give me the data. I'd love to get that data and analyze that data. There's a lot that's not studied because we don't have the right data.
So most of the firms are what, medium size, big size?
Well, when you're looking at executive compensation, you're looking at the S&P 1500, and so you're going to have a mixture. You're going to have some small cap firms, mid cap firms, and large cap firms. But I will tell you that many analyses tend to skew to the larger firms, unless you're hand collecting the data, which seems to be a lost art these days. People are not as reluctant. I lost my hair from fluorescent bulbs in the library. So,
Oh, are you sure?
yeah, so my colleagues are like, well, let's just spin